Welcome to my channel, Warm Cozy Blanket. Today you are waiting for a creepy story that will not leave you indifferent. Thank you for subscribing to my channel and liking this video. Make yourself comfortable and get ready for some real creepiness. The Silent Divide. Chapter 1. The Weight of Routine. Claire Harper was 35 years old, and her life revolved around two constants: the rhythmic beep of the cash register at the local grocery store where she worked as a cashier, and the persistent hum of anxiety that never quite left her mind. Claire had been diagnosed with social anxiety disorder, SAD, when she was 22. Back then, it felt like a label that explained everything wrong with her. Why she couldn't hold eye contact during conversations. Why crowded rooms made her chest tighten. Why even small talk felt like navigating a minefield. But now, 13 years later, Claire had learned to live with it. Or so she told herself. Her days were predictable, safe, and carefully structured. She woke up at 6:15 a.m., brewed a single cup of chamomile tea, and sat by the window in her tiny apartment overlooking the parking lot below. At 7:00 a.m., she would leave for work, walking the same route every day, counting the cracks in the sidewalk to calm her nerves. By 7:30 a.m., she'd be at her station behind the checkout counter, scanning groceries for customers who rarely acknowledged her beyond a muttered, "Thank you." It wasn't glamorous, but it was manageable. And for someone like Claire, manageable was enough. That was until he started coming into the store. Chapter 2. The Stranger. He first appeared on a Tuesday morning, just after the breakfast rush. Claire noticed him immediately, not because he stood out in any obvious way, but because he seemed off. He wore a nondescript gray hoodie pulled low over his face, and his hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans. Most people avoided making direct eye contact with Claire, which suited her just fine. But this man didn't glance away or pretend not to see her. Instead, he stared. His cart contained only 3 items: a loaf of white bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a pack of cigarettes. Simple enough. Yet something about the way he placed them on the conveyor belt unnerved her. Deliberate, calculated, as if each item carried some hidden meaning. "Good morning," Claire said automatically, her voice barely above a whisper. It was part of her routine, a polite gesture she extended to all customers regardless of whether they responded. The man tilted his head slightly, studying her as though trying to decipher a puzzle. "Morning," he replied, his tone flat but not unkind. His eyes lingered on her name tag before flicking back to her face. For a moment, Claire thought he might say something else, but instead, he handed her a crumpled $20 bill and waited silently while she rang up his purchases. When the transaction was complete, Claire slid the receipt across the counter. "Have a nice day," she murmured, already turning her attention to the next customer in line. She expected him to leave without another word, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "You're good at what you do," he said softly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." And then he was gone, disappearing through the automatic doors without looking back. Chapter 3: The Intrusion. At first, Claire dismissed the encounter as nothing more than an odd moment in an otherwise ordinary day. People said strange things sometimes. It happened. What bothered her more was how unsettled she felt afterward. His words replayed in her mind long after her shift ended, gnawing at her thoughts like a splinter she couldn't remove. Over the next few weeks, the man returned regularly. Always on Tuesdays, always with the same items: bread, peanut butter, cigarettes. Each time, their interactions grew slightly longer. He began asking questions, casual ones at first, about the weather or the store's hours, but gradually, they became more personal. "How long have you worked here?" he asked one morning, his gaze steady. "About 8 years," Claire replied, keeping her focus on the scanner. "That's dedication," he said, almost approvingly. Most people wouldn't stick around a place like this for so long. Claire shrugged, unsure how to respond. She didn't consider her job a testament to dedication. It was simply what she knew. A safe harbor in a world that often felt too loud, too fast, too overwhelming. Still, the man's comments lingered, planting seeds of doubt in her mind. Was she wasting her life? Should she want more? These were questions she had long since stopped asking herself, content to exist within the confines of her routine. But now they resurfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. Then came the note. Chapter 4: The Note. It was tucked beneath the loaf of bread, folded neatly into quarters. Claire didn't notice it until after the man had paid and left, leaving her alone with the unsettling feeling that she was being watched. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, almost clinical. "I know you feel trapped. You don't have to be. Let me help." For a moment, Claire couldn't breathe. Her heart pounded in her chest as panic clawed its way up her throat. Who was this man? How could he possibly know how she felt? And why did he care? She considered showing the note to her manager, or maybe calling the police, but fear held her back. What if they laughed at her? What if they thought she was overreacting? After all, it was just a note. Harmless words on a piece of paper. Or so she tried to convince herself. Chapter 5: The Descent. The visits continued, each one more invasive than the last. The man's questions grew bolder, probing deeper into Claire's life. He asked about her family. She didn't have much contact with them. Her hobbies, she didn't have any. Her dreams, she hadn't dared to dream in years. Every interaction left her feeling exposed, vulnerable, as though he were peeling back layers of her soul she had worked so hard to protect. And then there were the gifts. They arrived sporadically, left in plain sight among the items in his cart. A book about overcoming anxiety. A playlist burned onto a CD labeled "For You." Once, he even brought her a small potted plant, a succulent, he explained, because they were resilient, like her. Claire wanted to refuse them, to tell him to stop, but the words caught in her throat. Part of her, the rational part, knew she should distance herself from him, report him, make him go away. But another part, a darker, quieter part, found comfort in his attention. No one had ever cared about her like this before. Not really, until the night she found the envelope. Chapter 6, The Envelope. Claire discovered the envelope late one evening when she returned home from work. It lay on her doorstep, propped against the doorframe, its stark white surface glowing faintly under the dim porch light. There was no stamp, no return address, just her name scrawled across the front in that same precise handwriting. Her stomach churned as she picked it up, torn between curiosity and dread. She hesitated for a moment, staring at it as though it might bite her, before finally stepping inside and locking the door behind her. She placed the envelope on the kitchen table, packing back and forth as if movement could somehow dispel the growing unease in her chest. After several minutes of internal debate, she forced herself to sit down and open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. With shaking hands, she unfolded it and read, "You deserve better than this life. I can show you how to break free. Trust me." Beneath the message was an address, a location she vaguely recognized as an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Claire's pulse quickened. This wasn't harmless anymore. This was dangerous. She crumpled the note in her fist, anger surging through her veins. Who did he think he was? Some self-appointed savior. He didn't know her. He didn't understand her struggles. All he had done was invade her space, manipulate her emotions, and make her feel, what? Grateful, obligated. No, she wouldn't let him control her. And yet, despite her resolve, she couldn't bring herself to throw the note away. Chapter 7, The Breaking Point. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and mounting paranoia. Claire alternated between rage and fear, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched. She double-checked her locks every night, drew the curtains tightly shut, and avoided looking directly at the windows. Still, she couldn't escape the sensation that eyes were on her, waiting, watching. At work, she scanned the aisles obsessively, searching for any sign of him. He hadn't shown up since leaving the envelope, but his absence only heightened her anxiety. Had he given up, moved on to someone else? Or was he biding his time, planning his next move? Her coworkers noticed the change in her demeanor. "You okay, Claire?" asked Janet, a fellow cashier, during one particularly quiet shift. "You seem jumpy lately." "I'm fine," Claire snapped, perhaps too sharply. Janet raised her hands in mock surrender and backed away, leaving Claire alone with her spiraling thoughts. By Friday, Claire was a wreck. She hadn't eaten properly in days, surviving on coffee and half-hearted bites of toast. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror looked gaunt, hollow-eyed, unfamiliar. She barely recognized herself. That night, As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she made a decision. She would confront him. Chapter 8: The Warehouse. The address led her to a crumbling brick building, surrounded by chain-link fences, topped with rusted barbed wire. It loomed in the darkness like a specter, its broken windows glinting faintly in the moonlight. Claire parked her car a block away, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She shouldn't be here. This was reckless, stupid, insane. But she couldn't turn back now. As she approached the warehouse, the air grew colder, heavier, as though the structure itself exuded menace. The main entrance was boarded up, but a side door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Taking a deep breath, Claire pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was cavernous and pitch black, save for a faint glow emanating from somewhere deeper within. Claire's footsteps echoed loudly against the concrete floor, each sound reverberating like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" There was no response. She moved cautiously toward the light, her senses on high alert. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at her. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and the further she ventured, the stronger the stench became. Finally, she reached the source of the light. A single bulb hanging from the ceiling, illuminating a makeshift workspace littered with papers, maps, and photographs. Claire froze as her eyes landed on the images pinned to the wall. They were pictures of her, dozens of them, taken outside her apartment, at the grocery store, even walking to work. Some were close-ups, capturing her expressions in startling detail. Others were candid shots, framing her in mundane moments of everyday life. Her breath hitched in her throat. "You came," a voice said behind her. Claire spun around, her heart hammering wildly. The man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Because you needed someone to see you," he said quietly. "To truly see you." Claire took a step back, her mind racing. "This isn't seeing me. This is stalking. This is obsession." "No," he countered, his tone firm. "This is connection. You've spent your whole life hiding, Claire, from people, from yourself. I'm offering you a way out." "A way out of what?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "My life, my choices. You don't get to decide what's best for me." For a moment, he said nothing, simply regarding her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. "A key. This unlocks something important," he said, holding it out to her. "Something that will set you free." Claire stared at the key, her mind reeling. Was this a trap, a test, or was he telling the truth? Before she could decide, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse, startling them both. Lights flooded the room as voices shouted from outside. Police don't move. Chapter 9. The Truth. The man cursed under his breath and bolted toward a side exit, disappearing into the shadows before Claire could react. Officers swarmed the warehouse moments later, surrounding her and demanding answers. "What are you doing here?" one of them asked, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. I don't know," Claire stammered, clutching the key tightly in her hand. It wasn't until they searched the premises that the full scope of the situation became clear. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the workspace was a collection of journals, letters, and surveillance equipment, all meticulously organized and cataloged. Among them was a file labeled Claire Harper, containing detailed notes on her daily routines, habits, and vulnerabilities. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. In the corner of the room, concealed behind a false wall, they found a second set of files. These belonged to other women who had vanished without a trace over the past decade. Their faces stared out from faded photographs, their stories reduced to cold statistics. Claire collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by the realization. "He wasn't helping me," she whispered. "He was hunting me." Chapter 10. The Aftermath. Weeks passed before Claire could begin to process what had happened. The man, identified as Ethan Cole, a former psychologist turned serial predator, was arrested and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping and attempted murder. Evidence suggested he had been targeting socially isolated individuals, preying on their insecurities to gain their trust before spiriting them away to God knows where. Claire survived, but the experience left scars far deeper than she cared to admit. Therapy sessions became a regular part of her routine, though progress was slow and painful. Nightmares plagued her sleep, and crowds still triggered waves of panic. Yet amidst the trauma, there was also clarity. For the first time in years, Claire allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life, one where she wasn't defined by fear or controlled by routine. She started volunteering at a local community center, teaching art classes to children. She reconnected with old friends, tentatively at first, but with increasing confidence. And the key, she kept it as a reminder, not of the danger she had faced, but of the strength she had found within herself. Because sometimes breaking free isn't about escaping the world. It's about learning to live in it.